So then, welcome everybody to Courtney's thesis defense today. Let me just briefly introduce the committee. Auken over there and I are the co-advisors, and I'm co-chairing the committee. The rest of the committee, Jim Huxler, and remotely we have two external members, Laurie Williams and Tom Zimmerman. And the procedure is the thing that we're usually doing. Courtney's going to give a talk, about 30 to 45 minutes, somewhere in that range. And afterward we have time for questions. We usually start with the committee, but open this up to everybody in the room. And I'll say more about this when we get there. And then at some point we'll kick everybody out, have a short deliberation, and then come back.
Awesome. Sounds good. Thank you. Thank you all for being here, and good afternoon. I am excited to defend my dissertation, supporting the sustainable use of open source software. So open source software is the digital equivalent to the roads and bridges that we rely on to get from point A to point B. However, despite our widespread reliance, the continued reliability and maintenance for many of these projects is no sure thing, with much of the creation and maintenance effort coming from volunteer maintainers. For example, Boxspout, which you see on the right here, was a widely used package used by thousands of GitHub projects. However, it was abandoned by its maintainers, who marked the repo as archived and also put a note at the top of the README. There we go. We also note that maintainers often disengage for totally normal reasons that we can't prevent, such as starting a family, switching jobs, or simply losing interest. And we also know from previous research that more often than not, even for widely used GitHub projects, when maintainers do disengage, nobody else steps up and the project is fully abandoned. Abandonment can transform an open source dependent...
Can I interrupt for 1 second?
Yeah, hi Laura.
Oh, wait, sorry, maybe. Okay, never mind. I'll go to a different view. I was just looking at your video and I was saying, we can only see half your screen, but I can switch views. Okay, never mind.
No worries, thank you. I mean, better safe than sorry. Alrighty. Okay, so abandonment can transform a dependency from a free resource to a costly liability. Alright, abandonment, especially of widely used packages, can create weak links that can expose downstream users to unanticipated risks, like unpatched vulnerabilities, costly unplanned migrations, and targeted supply chain attacks. For example, the EventStream incident. EventStream is a Node.js library which was created in 2011. By 2015, it had entered maintenance mode because its original maintainer had moved on to maintaining projects more in alignment with their interests. But at the same time, it had become deeply embedded in the Node.js ecosystem, being used by millions of downstream users. This combination of maintainer disengagement and widespread popularity created a social engineering opportunity for a malicious attacker who volunteered to take over maintenance and implement a feature requested by another user. And once the attacker gained commit access, they introduced a dependency which contained obfuscated malicious code targeting cryptocurrency wallets. The incident wasn't actually detected until November of 2018, at which point there was widespread discourse about whether the original maintainer had more responsibility to vet the new maintainer. But ultimately, he had no obligation to do so. And in fact, identifying and remediating abandoned dependencies is considered a supply chain security best practice. And more so, recently in the past year, abandonment has become much more salient as not just a best practice, but also a compliance requirement, in part due to updated standards like PCI DSS, which is a security compliance standard for organizations that handle payment card data. PCI DSS 4.0.1 makes end-of-life software a clearer compliance concern by explicitly requiring organizations to review software in use at least annually, including checking to see whether they still receive security patches, have announced end-of-life plans, and also requires organizations to maintain senior management approved remediation plans for end-of-life software. The future-dated requirements in this policy came into effect March 31st, 2025, and a year later now, organizations and auditors in regulated sectors, particularly the financial industry, are increasingly feeling the practical impact of those requirements, driving renewed attention into identifying and remediating open source abandoned dependencies. Dependency abandonment is one of many supply chain security threat vectors. This dissertation supports the effective identification and remediation of abandonment while echoing the broader calls for better security dependency operations made by the Secure Software Supply Chain Center. And when you're facing disruption like abandonment, at a high level, there are two paths you can take. You can either try to fight it and try to prevent it from happening, or you can try to adapt to it and figure out how to work around it. And by and large, open source sustainability research has primarily thus far focused on trying to prevent abandonment disruptions by keeping particular projects and ecosystems alive and maintained. Now, my work intentionally takes a different tact. I help users adapt to and navigate abandonment disruptions when they occur. In this dissertation, I shift the focus from maintainers to users, and I explore, measure, and improve the processes used by developers facing dependency abandonment disruptions, thus supporting the sustainable use of open source software. I break down this high-level research agenda into 3 interconnected projects. First, exploring through a qualitative interview study. Then, measuring through large-scale quantitative statistical analysis. And finally, improving through theory-driven LLM-based tool development. I will now walk through each of these 3 steps. So, now that we've laid out the outline for this talk, let's begin by exploring dependency abandonment through a qualitative interview study. As a starting point, to better understand what developers currently do when they deal with abandonment, as well as the challenges they face, we began by asking 2 research questions. How do developers prepare for the risk of open source dependency abandonment? And how do developers deal with open source dependency abandonment once it occurs? We conducted semi-structured exploratory interviews with 33 developers who had faced dependency abandonment, and we analyzed the interview data using iterative thematic analysis, and we also performed a validity check with interviewees. We found that many developers struggle to respond to abandonment, often citing a lack of guidance and recommendations. Many developers rely on a costly trial and error process where they attempt to use a number of different solutions in an attempt to remediate abandonment. To give an example of the kind of process a developer might go through, let's say they realize a dependency was abandoned because they trace back a language incompatibility error to the dependency. They may begin by creating an internal fork where they remediate whatever the direct issue is. Then they might go seek out insights from the community on where do we go from here, what's going on. And then, if they're lucky enough to find a suitable alternative, they might go through the trouble of switching to it. Interviewees often discussed the costs associated with abandonment. These costs were often derived from either the actions taken in response, for example, the time and effort necessary to migrate, or from the direct disruptive impacts of abandonment when it occurred, for example, the roadblocks caused by language incompatibility issues. Now, developers can prepare in actions in an attempt to reduce the anticipated cost of abandonment. For example, localizing dependencies via abstraction layers or removing unnecessary or high-risk dependencies. But the catch-22 here is those preparatory actions themselves have a cost, and many developers struggle with the higher-level trade-off in question of, does the investment into upfront prep and proactive response worth the potential cost savings later? And in addition to actions that developers can take to help their own individual projects respond, we also heard about community-oriented responses to abandonment, which help collective downstream communities respond more efficiently. For example, by posting pointers to forks and alternatives in relevant public discussion channels, such as this issue thread you see here, where the original poster started by creating the title called, "Is This Issue or Is This Project Dead?", where they point out the fact that there hasn't really been a lot of activity for a while. Then another user responded suggesting a suitable alternative, and then somebody else who had already gone through the trouble of creating a fork and patching it actually responded and suggested their fix, which dealt with some of the language incompatibility issues with Python 3. Now, community-oriented responses can help increase the collective efficiency of downstream responses, but they can also increase coordination efforts, leading to a high-level question of, for a given disruption, when does it make sense to respond individually versus collectively? Another key finding I just want to highlight before moving on is that, additionally, identifying abandonment in the first place often required significant time and effort. Many developers relied on a costly manual investigation process where they looked at package characteristics that they judged to be signals of activity, such as the last time an issue was closed or the last time a commit was made. And this in and of itself created a bottleneck in the process of responding to abandonment because this approach did not scale well, for the average size of the modern NPM dependency tree. Therefore, we hypothesized, following from signaling theory, that increasing information transparency surrounding abandonment disruptions can make them more visible and in turn support downstream responses. So, to wrap this up with a bow, identifying abandonment can be difficult and it can create a bottleneck in the process of remediating abandonment. Many developers feel like they're winging it when they faced abandonment with little to no guidance. Responding to abandonment was often, therefore, a trial and error process, and philosophies vary widely. Some developers were worried about all their abandonment. Most were only worried about some. Some believed in proactive responses, others didn't. So there was a lot of variation here. But to take a step back, after the first explore stage, we have a much better understanding, and we also have lots of anecdotal evidence. But now in order to inform intervention design, we want to perform a large-scale quantitative statistical analysis of the prevalence and response to dependency abandonment. So in this study, we have 3 key objectives. We want to measure the prevalence of dependency abandonment, how do people react, and what factors influence those reactions. And to accomplish this objective, we used 4 research questions, which I will introduce sequentially. So first, to look at the prevalence, we asked, how prevalent is widely used package abandonment and how many downstream projects are subsequently exposed? So before we could go ahead and measure all the abandoned dependencies or abandoned packages, we had to actually define and operationalize package abandonment, which was a non-trivial challenge. However, for the sake of this study, we came up with 2 heuristics. First, explicit notice abandonment, which is where the maintainers of a package publicly and explicitly announce their intention to no longer do so, such as by putting a note at the top of the README or by marking the repo as archived. Then we have activity-based abandonment, which is where there's a clear shift in activity patterns from regular maintenance to an extended period of inactivity. Now, our observation period for this study was between January of 2015 and December of 2020. So we were able to use the power of hindsight for this heuristic, which was quite helpful. In terms of our methods, we started by analyzing metadata for all packages in the NPM ecosystem to identify the subset that were widely used, which we defined as packages that had at least 10,000 downloads and at least 1 month during that observation window. Once we identified all the widely used packages, we used our 2 heuristics to identify all the widely used abandoned packages. Then, to find downstream users, we searched across World of Code to find all dependent projects on GitHub that ever depended on any of the packages. Then, to make data analysis tractable, we generated a large random sample and analyzed GitHub trace data for each project to identify the exposed dependents. And by exposed dependents, I mean dependent projects that were actively depending on the package at the time when it was abandoned. We then used statistical inference to calculate population exposure estimates. And the first thing we found is that abandonment is common, even among widely used packages, with roughly 15% of the widely used packages in our sample becoming abandoned during our 6-year observation window. In terms of downstream responses, we estimate that roughly 283,000 GitHub projects were directly exposed to abandonment from the roughly 4,000 abandoned packages we identified. Of those 283,000, we estimate that roughly 78,000 were active themselves post-abandonment. Now, to contextualize this a little bit, given the fact that there are hundreds of millions of projects on GitHub, the actual direct exposure numbers are really not that big at all. However, abandonment has much more wide-reaching impacts when we consider indirect transitive dependencies. And if you're interested in hearing more about that, check out the discussion section of this paper where we get into it. Alrighty, so then, to look at the reaction, we asked how often and how fast do projects remove abandoned dependencies? We started by using our sample of projects exposed to abandonment from our Q1, and then we also generated samples of widely used packages that experienced standard updates and vulnerability patch releases during that same observation window, so we could contextualize the response to abandonment with those other established dependency management practices. We then used a standard, the same analogous process to identify a sample of downstream projects exposed to the dependency event for those 2 baseline comparison groups. And then for all the exposed dependent projects, we analyzed the project's package.json to measure whether, how long, if they responded, and if so, how long it took. And then we used Kaplan-Meier survival curves to compare the time to response. So, only 18% of the dependent projects exposed to abandonment in our sample removed the dependency before our cutoff date for responses, which was September of 2023. Now, for those who did, the average time from abandonment to removal was 13.5 months. And that might sound like a while, but just to contextualize it, something to note is that it can be really difficult to identify and make judgment calls about abandonment, especially when they're based on a project's live activity patterns. In order for us to identify abandonment, we were able to use the power of hindsight, but for developers who are actively trying to do it live in the moment, it can be even more difficult. Nonetheless, even so, on average, developers who did responded faster than our conservative heuristic. But now let's dig into this data a little bit deeper with that survival analysis I was talking about. All right, so we are interested in the amount of time between the event of occurrence, or we're interested in the amount of time between dependency event occurrence, either abandonment, update release, or patch release, and when each dependent project responds, with the response being the event of interest. And this is called time to event data. Now, the difficulty with analyzing time to event data is that it's often right censored, meaning that we have incomplete data for some of those subjects. And that either means one of two things. It either means the project did not experience the event of interest before our end of our cutoff, or it means that the downstream project became inactive during our observation window, meaning we would no longer expect them to respond, right? Because they're not doing anything. Now, survival modeling is designed to account for right censorship using an independent censoring mechanism which aligns subjects on time to event of interest or censorship. And once we have our data like this, then we can go ahead and do our survival modeling. Speaking of, this is a Kaplan-Meier survival curve showing the probability of dependency abandonment not being resolved by a surviving downstream user over time. To give you an example of how to interpret a point estimate at a given time step, at 25 months, or roughly 2 years after abandonment, the probability of downstream users not responding is about 0.77. So what that means is roughly 77% of surviving downstream projects in our sample have not responded, and roughly 23% have. So, although on the surface I just said only 18% of our downstream projects responded, it turned out that that was actually because a lot of the downstream projects became inactive themselves during our observation window, meaning we would no longer expect them to respond. And if we actually account for that and appropriately remediate for that, as we do with the survival curve, we can see that closer to roughly 40% of surviving downstream projects respond eventually. Now let's contextualize this with our baseline comparisons. Off the bat, we can see that security patches are responded to faster and at higher rates than the other dependency events. And we can also see that developers tend to respond to abandonment at similar rates and with similar latency as they do to standard dependency updates. And what this tells us is that developers struggle with abandonment in a similar way that they do to standard dependency management and updates. So, now, finally, for the influence. We were interested in exploring the factors that influence responses. From the first chapter, we know that some developers are highly regimented and others are not. But it's unclear if those projects are associated with, just generally having good development practices. So, for our Q3, we explore this by asking what project characteristics are associated with removing abandoned dependencies. Then, to evaluate our hypothesis surrounding information transparency supporting downstream responses, we ask our Q4. How does announcing the abandonment status of a package impact how fast dependent projects remove the abandoned dependency? So, what we did is we used our abandoned or downstream projects that experienced or that faced abandonment, and we took a snapshot of each of them at the time of abandonment. We did a broad literature survey to identify project characteristics that may have an association, and then we operationalized them. We used a multiple logistic regression model to look at the relationship between project characteristics and likelihood of removal, and we used a Cox proportional hazard survival model to look at the relationship between providing explicit notice and likelihood of response. We found that projects with more mature governance practices, higher dependency churn, and less technical lag are all significantly more likely to remove abandoned dependencies. And for now, right, now for what I think is the most exciting finding of this study, it turns out that yes, in fact, providing explicit notice of abandonment does support downstream responses. More specifically, publicly announcing abandonment increases the likelihood of downstream project removal by 58%, holding all other covariates constant. This is very exciting for two reasons. The first reason it's very exciting is because it aligns almost exactly with what developers were telling us in the first measure, or explore stage, right? Actually identifying abandonment is really hard, and so are those live subjective judgment calls. But when explicit notice is provided, it takes out a lot of the guesswork. It's also exciting because it indicates that what we're seeing is at least in part due to a lack of awareness, which we can support through tooling to improve the automated identification of abandonment, which we'll get right into next. So to wrap up the second chapter, dependency abandonment is a prevalent issue. Developers care about abandonment, but many may lack awareness or require extended observation periods to make judgments. Most exposed projects don't respond, but responses are significantly faster when explicit notice is provided. And finally, increasing information transparency surrounding abandonment helps support downstream responses. So now we take those insights from our measure stage and we directly apply them to create our theory-driven LLM-based tool. So our goal starting out was to create a prototype tool to help with identifying abandonment. We could do something like Dependabot, except for abandonment. However, from talking to developers, we already know that for a lot of them, they don't care about the abandonment of all of their dependencies equally. So we wanted to be careful of this. In fact, reflecting on key usability issues of existing software component analysis tools helped inform our approach. First of all, we already know that too many notifications, especially ones considered spurious, can lead to notification fatigue and tool disengagement. We also know that while manual configuration is technically possible, it's often practically infeasible due to the overhead required. Therefore, our goal became to develop intelligent pre-configuration that predicts which abandonment would be disruptive to a project given the context of their dependency usage. And then the question just becomes, well, how do you do that? So we considered a couple different approaches. First, we considered the traditional approach. We could start by developing a theoretical understanding of the factors that influence it. We could operationalize that, collect extensive training data at scale, and build a conventional machine learning model. However, there are a couple downsides to this approach. Namely, first of all, it turns out that it's quite difficult to operationalize nuanced context-specific factors at scale. It's also extremely time-intensive. We also, of course, tried the more modern approach of throwing it at an LLM as a zero-shot baseline, and this did just okay. What we ended up settling on was actually a hybrid approach to prediction that combined theory and context to get better LLM performance than the zero-shot baseline alone. And motivating this approach is our hypothesis that large language models equipped with theory-driven reasoning and contextual information can accurately predict the impact of abandonment disruptions better than LLMs alone to support developer decision-making. Now, to accomplish our goal, we started by extracting expert knowledge through need-finding interviews and developing a theoretical framework. We then operationalized and extracted our theory-driven context, developed our theory-driven structured reasoning prompt, built our classifier, and then performed an independent user study to evaluate its performance. So, first step, extracting expert knowledge and developing a theoretical framework. We performed semi-structured need-finding interviews with 22 developers, where we spoke with them about their current project's dependencies, asking them whether they believe, for a given one, it would be impactful to their project if abandoned or not, and why. We analyzed the data using iterative thematic analysis to develop a theoretical framework which contained 4 factors. First, the importance of functionality. So how important is the functionality provided by the package to the project? Then we have the depth of integration. How difficult is it to replace the dependency considering the depth of its integration in the project's codebase? Then we have the availability of alternatives. How difficult is it to replace the dependency considering the availability of suitable alternatives? And finally, we have external environmental pressures. So, how likely is it that external environmental changes will force the project to act on the dependency's abandonment? Alrighty, and so once we have that, we use the retrieval augmented generation pattern to extract a body of relevant context-specific information informed by our theoretical understanding, which would be sufficient for a human expert to make judgments so that the LLMs could make similar reasoning and judgment steps. More concretely, for each of the factors in our theoretical framework, we asked, can an LLM effectively assess this given its existing knowledge base? And if not, what additional context should we provide? And we ended up operationalizing and extracting the following context. First, we have the project's README that just gives context about its domain and purpose, the project's package.json file, which gives information about its dependencies and configuration information. Then we have the dependencies README, which gives context about its domain and purpose. And then finally, we have relevant code usage snippets from the project of that package being used. Now, the first three pieces of information here were like trivial to collect, right? It was like a call to the GitHub API or so. However, for the third one, we relied on static code analysis. For the sake of time, I won't go through the relationship between all the theoretical factors and the context information, but I'll give you a couple quick examples just so you get a sense. So, availability of alternatives, right? There are databases that we could provide to the LLM, but it turned out that they were actually surprisingly good at being aware of this sort of alternative information on their own, so there was very little value added by providing it. But for something like the depth of integration, this requires context-specific understanding. And the engineering challenge is we can't just pass the whole project's code base to the LLM as context. So we used static code analysis via CodeQL using keyword search and global data flow analysis. Now, to give a high-level bird's-eye view of the classifier's architecture, we leveraged our theoretical framework to determine what context-specific information to provide, and then also to develop our theory-driven structured reasoning prompt. These two artifacts were the input to the model. Then, the prompt gave the LLM a role-playing directive, a task description, and instructions to perform independent chain-of-thought reasoning for each of our 4 theoretical factors, followed by a meta-reasoning step that synthesizes it into a binary classification. All of which is captured in a structured JSON output with the overall as well as per-factor reasoning chains. So, we did an internal evaluation of our approach across 4 LLMs: DeepSeek, Gemini 2.0, GPT 4.0, and Llama 3.3. We selected them because they represented the state-of-the-art general-purpose LLMs at the time, and they all supported context windows of at least 128,000 tokens. We used the judgments from our need-finding interviews as the ground truth dataset, which contained 82 project dependency pairs. For each model, we ran 4 configurations as an evaluation study. First the zero-shot baseline, then the theory-driven reasoning prompt only, then just the theory-driven context, and finally the full Abandonbot approach with both the theory-driven reasoning and context. Each configuration was run 10 times per project dependency pair to account for stochastic variation, and we report average macro F1 score with standard deviations. So the results show that all models perform best with the full approach, both theory-driven reasoning and context, with GPT 4.0 and DeepSeek having the best overall performance, tied at an overall macro F1 score of 0.75. We ended up selecting DeepSeek for the independent evaluation because it offered comparable performance at a substantially lower inference cost. So it was a practical engineering trade-off for a tool meant to run at ecosystem scale. Now, we thought a lot about how to actually evaluate this tool, and I'll just give you the gist. So we sent surveys to open source maintainers about 3 of their current project's dependencies. And in step 1 for each of those 3 dependencies, we asked them to evaluate the predicted impact of that package's dependency, or abandonment, on their project with no context. So just, if this was abandoned, would it impact your project, yes or no? In the second step, we provide the classifier's reasoning and judgments, frame it as a prototype tool's predictions, and ask them to give feedback on it. And the results from our independent evaluation study demonstrate that our classifier is effective at predicting project-specific abandonment impact. 75% of the time, the users fully agreed with the reasoning. And the survey got a lot of positive feedback in the open response questions, with lots of developers saying that the intelligent pre-configuration approach was an exciting one that they would be interested in seeing in their tools in the future. So that was cool. So, summary of the key findings. We identified 4 contextual factors that influence the impact of abandonment on a specific project: depth of integration, availability of alternatives, importance of functionality, and external environmental pressures. Developers were interested in intelligent pre-configuration that could predict which abandonment is impactful rather than relying on them to do manual setup. Our LLM-based classifier using theory-driven structured reasoning and context can effectively approximate developer judgments of abandonment impact better than zero-shot LLM baselines, demonstrating the value of combining empirical theory-driven work with LLMs as reasoning engines. So, to take a big old step back, in the 3 projects that encompass this research vision, I explore how developers currently deal with abandonment as well as the challenges they face. I measure the prevalence and response to abandonment across the NPM ecosystem at scale. And finally, I improve the way that developers deal or identify dependency abandonment through theory-driven LLM-based prototype tool development. To accomplish this, we iteratively designed a multidimensional mixed methods approach combining user-focused qualitative methods, large-scale data analysis and statistical modeling techniques, as well as user-centered participatory designs and LLM-based tooling development. These 3 interconnected projects together represent a body of work centered around supporting developers who must face the risks and realities of open source dependency abandonment. For my committee members in the document, I know you saw my thesis statement. I just wanted to include it here as framing at the end to pull everything together, so I'll read it out loud. By shifting the focus of sustainability research from maintainers to users, I explore, measure, and improve how developers navigate open source dependency abandonment disruptions to enable the sustainable use of open source digital infrastructure and the software supply chains that depend on it. I demonstrate that abandonment is an unsupported disruption where developers lack adequate tooling and guidance. Increasing information transparency surrounding abandonment significantly accelerates downstream response, and that a theory-driven LLM-based classifier equipped with context-specific information can effectively predict project-specific abandonment impact, supporting the automated identification of noteworthy abandonment without overwhelming developers. So, that was the core of my thesis. But the last couple of months, a question that I have been thinking a lot about is, does any of this abandonment stuff matter anymore now that agentic Gen AI technology exists? And just to be clear, this is where my research ends and the discussion begins. And it'll be quick, I promise. So, I just have a couple things to say on this because honestly I really don't have all the answers. But in terms of does abandonment matter anymore? Maybe yes and maybe no. It might not matter anymore because autonomous coding agents could automate routine project maintenance, so projects never have to die even if you don't want to maintain it anymore. It could also make it so abandonment doesn't matter because it could support automated dependency migration, which, some people in this very department have recently had lots of promising, exciting work in the direction of. Maybe it still does matter. AI slop overwhelms open source projects and, a lot of them end up closing contributions to external contributors, which can be a short-term remediation strategy, but can also have long-term impacts on sustainability. Also, escalating threats to maintainer well-being and essential trust could lead to increased rates of developer burnout and in turn, package abandonment. Now, the question of does abandonment matter anymore now that agentic coding exists is an instance of a question which I have that relates to the larger body of my work and the software industry more broadly. So one of the central findings of this dissertation is that abandonment becomes costly often because organizations fundamentally underestimate their dependence on the infrastructure they take for granted, only discovering the true cost when it's too late to avoid it. And these tensions mirror questions now facing the software engineering community at large. What do we lose when we optimize for short-term cost without understanding the full scope of what sustains the system? So again, I don't have all the questions, or the answers yet. I do have lots of questions, just not the answers. But I will be pursuing this in my future work. And I believe that sustainable Gen AI tooling integration in the software industry requires an intentional shift towards an engineering mindset. Most critically, we must preserve our ability to make these decisions. Higher level decisions about architecture, risk, and ethics all require context, judgments, and accountability. Ceding control of those decisions does not just jeopardize the software quality and security, it also surrenders control over the systems that underpin our digital society. So, as software engineering researchers and practitioners, we must not automate away higher level reasoning and human decision-making autonomy for the sake of speed and cost optimization. We must preserve it while it is still ours to delegate. To wrap things up on a lighter note, I'd like to acknowledge and thank all of my amazing advisors. Oh, no, I wasn't done there. All of my amazing advisors, collaborators, and co-authors. Every piece of work I've showed you here has been highly collaborative, and it would not have been done without all of these amazing people, institutions, and just great work. I'd also like to take a brief moment right now to thank everybody in S3C2. I started working with Bogdan and Christian as an RU student in 2018. And that was the summer that I learned that I love research. And over the past 8 years, this department has done nothing but support, encourage, and help me thrive. Sorry, I didn't think I was going to cry. It's kind of embarrassing. I wouldn't put this in. So just thank you so much. Thank you to all of you.